Catherine Sasanov, and I'm the author of a new book of poems titled Had Slaves. I came to write this book after going through some family papers in 2005, where I found a will written by a great-great-great-grandfather in southwest Missouri, Richard Steele, in 1857, and in it he was bequeathing 9 men, women, and children to his family members. And it staggered me to find this out. I grew up in northern Illinois. What stories my dad told about his family in Missouri had never discussed slavery or slaveholding. And I think between growing up in Illinois and my family being from Missouri, no one's wealthy, it never occurred to me to think that slavery could have been part of my family's history. So I began doing research trying to find out what happened to these people my family thought it was fine to own. And so I went to Springfield, Missouri, went to Tennessee, started doing archival and field research, seeing if I could find out what happened to the Steele slaves and their descendants. What I found and what the book reveals is how to look into slave lives is to look mainly into legal documents, because it's really rare that I didn't find anything in the words of the slaves and freedmen themselves. And other than legalese, probate files, bills of sale, wills, tax documents, it would be bits and pieces, shards and fragments of lives that I'd be trying to pull together, as well as reading about what was going on in the landscape at that time among other slaves, and then trying to pull that all together to at least get a glimpse of a person's life. I wanted these people to not just be part of this sort of undifferentiated mass that we refer to as slaves. And I wanted them to be more than a bit of cursive on the page, more than just their given names that were there. So my poems reflect that and talk about that. They also go into the Jim Crow period as well. So that is what I was doing in terms of collecting information to write the book. Probably the big thing I learned in writing this book was that, and I think it's the thing I kind of want to get across to people, I didn't think about who the audience would be when I wrote the book. And I hope anybody would want to read it, but I particularly think it'd be good for white people to read it, because, as I said, it was not on my radar as a northerner that slaveholding would be a part of my past, and especially in a border state like Missouri. I just never thought about it. And the things that I came away with were, for example, my family goes back to North Carolina. I had a Revolutionary War soldier ancestor. He held slaves, so he's fighting for freedom, from the British, but he's holding slaves. The slaveholders in southwest Missouri, my ancestors, they were small grain farmers, so they weren't wealthy people. They weren't growing cotton, they weren't growing rice. It wasn't the usual locale. I think most people, including myself, I found, have this very gone with the wind idea of the environment that cultivates slavery. And it's not the big house with the huge plantation, lots of slaves. Most slaveholders held 3 slaves or less. So that was huge for me to know. Also that my ancestors, it turns out they were for the Union, but they held slaves. And in fact, 3 of them enlisted 3 of their slaves into the U.S. colored troops at the end. And I can't say for sure, but I think it was a financial consideration. They could get $300 for doing this, It was 1864. They probably saw the writing on the wall and knew their slaves were going to go free, or they were going to escape, or bushwhackers were going to take them away. So in a sense, they gave them their freedom, but in this very strange way. So I found out that, and also I had ministers. I grew up Catholic, but my dad's side was all Presbyterian, and there were at least 3 Presbyterian ministers who had slaves. So those things, the locale, and who owned slaves, those were the big things that were revelations for me, that I hope the book, will introduce to people. There's a notes section in it as well, just to give people a bit more information. I hope the poems are meant to stand on their own, but I felt like our racial history's been taught so poorly that notes would be, extra information would be useful to people. So those were the big things that were telling to me from it.